I travel alone a lot and have been super fortunate to have minimal creepy encounters, but this one still makes my spine tingle. I was in London for 6 days on a stopover on my way back to Canada from 6 weeks in South Africa. I'd been working in South Africa, very long but rewarding days, so the London stop was touristy and lazy. It was just a nice reset before I got back home to Canada. There was a pub a block or two from the hostel I was staying in that I ate at every night. It was cheap, cozy, and never too crowded, so I'd bring a book, order a pint, and eat supper. I had chatted with the waitress a couple nights in a row. She was very kind, my age, and we exchanged a few stories. She knew from chatting that I was traveling alone and staying in a hostel nearby. Well, on day 4, I followed my usual route from the hostel to the pub and greeted the waitress. She said hello and quickly brought over a drink menu. Not 30 seconds after I had sat down, a man walked in and sat a few tables away. She motioned to him and mumbled, "Do you know him?" I kind of laughed and said, "Definitely not. I don't know anyone in London." She nodded and positioned herself between myself and the man and said quietly, "He got off a bench and followed you from the street over. I don't like the look of him and I thought I'd just ask. It might be nothing, but thought I'd mention it anyway." I thanked her and said I'm sure it's just a coincidence. She shrugged and took my order, and the evening proceeded as usual. The man also ordered a drink, but no food. I stayed for over 2 hours, reading, eating, and drinking. The pub was quiet, and a few other people or groups came and went, but the man stayed. He drank the 1 pint and refused top-ups. The waitress kept a close eye on him and me, and stopped over to chat several times between refills, but didn't bring him up again. When I was finishing my last drink and preparing to leave, I glanced over at him and noticed he looked on the edge of his seat, like he was preparing to leave too. I hadn't really thought much of it until then, but my stomach suddenly knotted up. It was dark and drizzly, and I had a short but lonesome walk back to my hostel. I suddenly felt distinctly unsafe. I summoned the waitress over to pay and asked her if she'd mind calling me a taxi as well. She nodded vigorously, and I knew she thought this was a good idea. The taxi showed up. I thanked the waitress and left. I hopped in the taxi, and I swear that old man thought I was so dumb for needing a drive for such a short distance, but whatever. I felt so much safer. I went back the next evening as it would be my last night in London, and I wanted to say goodbye. I wanted to thank the waitress for her hospitality, friendship, and ultimately looking out for me. When I arrived, she ran over and said she was so glad I'd called that cab. I guess right after I left, that man left too, seemingly really agitated. He'd not even asked for a bill, just left money on the table and stormed out. She felt very confident that he had seen me walking alone, followed me in, and was planning to, quote, approach me when I left. What would have happened then, neither her nor I really wanted to think about. I had a lovely last night at the pub, and we even shared some small glasses of wine together for a quick cheers before I left. I don't walk places alone at night anymore, even if it is just a short distance. I was backpacking my way through Asia in the early 2000s and spent quite a bit of time in Hong Kong. Hong Kong Island is pretty hilly to say the least. I found myself near a fancy hotel, I can't remember which hotel exactly, that was on a higher plane than where I wanted to go and didn't see an easy way to get down. I spotted an entrance to a set of stairs that I thought could exit to the street below. These weren't outdoor stairs, they led underground in retrospect. Probably the fire exit for the hotel. The door was unlocked and I just went in. Each floor had a door that I assumed led into the hotel or would exit to the street. I found each one was locked. I probably should have just left as soon as I saw the first one was locked, but I was young and dumb and thought that eventually there would be a door that led out to the street below. So I kept going down this extremely dark stairwell, trying to open each door. When I finally reached the bottom, I noticed a bunch of shapes in the darkness, mostly rags and boxes. Then I noticed the movement. There were maybe 5 or 6 men down there all sprawled out, not talking or anything, but they noticed me and at least one was staring at me, the whites of his eyes reflecting what little bit of light was down there. They were definitely high. I can only assume I had barged my way into some sort of heroin den. I just sort of stood there looking at them, and they were looking at me, no one saying anything. I slowly backed up out of their sight and then rushed all the way back up, maybe 5 floors or so. Maybe it's not too creepy compared to other stories, but I was definitely freaked out for a while. It was totally dark and no one knew I was down there. Of course, maybe they were equally freaked out that someone had barged into their secret spot. 2016, I hiked from New Jersey to Virginia on the Appalachian Trail. I was on the part of the trail known as the roller coaster not far from Harper's Ferry. I hit heavy rain, and the trail became a stream, and all of my rain gear decided to give out. Everything I had was soaked. I had to spend the next day waiting for my gear to dry out at the nearest shelter. Around noon, I can see someone walking intersecting to the trail. I can tell he's not a hiker, being he had no bag and was wearing jeans. He told me his name was Steve. He was asking me if I knew a Chris or a Jim. Being that no one uses regular names on the trail, there would be no way to identify them even if they were real people. Steve said he had walked from DC about 80 miles and was told to meet Chris and Jim for further instructions. He said he had information, and the NSA was after him. I figured that the guy was having a mental break or something and felt sorry that I couldn't help him. Not too far off was a free hiker hostel, maybe about a 4-hour walk. The hostel was just a shelter that was enclosed with a wood-burning stove, but next to it was a house that a ridge runner, someone who does trail maintenance, lived at. I directed him towards that. After all my stuff had dried, I headed to a hostel and got there early evening. As I'm walking up, I can see the ridge runner and Steve arguing. The ridge runner is yelling at Steve, telling him to take a trail to a road to leave this area. If he did not, the ridge runner would call the police for trespassing. At the shelter, I saw familiar people who filled me in on what had happened. At every shelter is a trail log. The log is a journal that keeps track of people who pass through and notes about what's happening on the trail. It's also a way to pass messages to people you might know behind you. Steve got a hold of the log and started looking for a message for him. He thought he had to decode the messages to find instructions for him. Steve started to write random things and crossing things out through the log. This action pissed off people who were already wary of Steve because of appearance of not looking like a fellow hiker. Steve also argued with a few people before this and made a fire to burn some paper he was carrying. They notified the ridge runner. People were pretty upset about Steve, so I never told them that I ran into him previously. I never saw Steve again and still think that he was a person with mental health issues having an episode. However, I do imagine the scenario where he was telling the truth and what his story was. Traveling in South America by myself as a 22-year-old woman. I arrived in Santiago, Chile by bus really late at night, like around 10 p.m. Shortly after I got off the bus, a guy comes up to me from the general area of the taxi stand and asks if I need a cab ride. I say yes. We start walking to his cab and it's really far away, like at least 5 blocks. I start to feel kind of uneasy, but I'm also in the middle of this big, unfamiliar city and just try to reassure myself that it's fine. I double check that his cab has all the normal brand markings when we finally get to it, and sit up front with my bag. That was more out of habit, as it's common to do this in Ubers in South America. I give him the address of the hostel I booked, and we small talk in Spanish for a few minutes of the ride. And then there's a bit of an unnatural pause, which he breaks by looking over at me and saying very calmly, "Are you scared?" Of course that really freaked me out, but I just tried to stay calm. I just laugh a bit and say, no, I'm good. Just tired and it's late. And he goes, well, you seemed pretty scared back there when we were walking. You know, there's a lot of bad people around here. Sometimes they pretend to be taxis. You never know who to trust. I've heard of women being sold after taking a bad taxi. Are you traveling here alone? He said that all while we were still driving through the middle of the city. It's dark and it's late, and now I'm painfully aware literally no one knows where I am. I was going to message my family with an update when I got to the hostel. They don't know I'm in Santiago. They think I'm still on the coast. Of course I don't say that and tell them that I'm always very careful, and actually my group of friends know I'm on the way and are waiting for me at the hostel. I see a stoplight coming up and was literally thinking that as soon as the car slowed down, I was going to make a break for it and just jump out of the car. Probably the most scared I've ever been in my life. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I see this guy reaching down for something under his seat, and my brain just goes, gun, 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 it's going to be a gun. Instead, he pulls out a pamphlet, and then he goes, but you know, there's always one thing we can trust, right? The Lord. Do you believe in God? And then proceeded to try and convert me for the remainder of the ride. It turned out to be harmless, but in the moment, that random religious cab driver scared the absolute shit out of me. Not creepy in the sense that I was scared, but creepy in the sense that I wanted this motherfucker to get away from me. I was taking a red-eye from Miami to Buenos Aires. It's a pretty long flight. Like an idiot, I thought that a middle seat at the front of the plane would be more desirable than a window or aisle seat at the back of the plane. It wasn't. So there I was, in the middle seat of the plane with older gentlemen on both sides of me. The unspoken rules of the airplane are as follows. The aisle seat can extend their leg into the aisle, the window seat can lean against the side of the plane, and the middle seat gets both armrests. Those are the rules. I've been traveling for work for a long time, and those are just the rules. The guy in the window seat must not have known the rules because he kept trying to push my arm off his armrest. I fought him for a little while, but eventually let him have the armrest and just tried to get some sleep. Things neither escalated nor de-escalated until about 30 minutes after we had taken off. A foul stench reached my nose, and I couldn't immediately identify its source. I briefly inspected my surroundings and discovered that my window seat neighbor had removed his shoes. Exposed and naked to the world, his greasy toes wiggled and shamelessly exuded an aroma that was a mix of sulfur, sausage gravy, and mold. To my absolute shock, he lifted his foot nearest me, slid it out from the space under the seat in front of him, and placed it in the adjacent space under the seat in front of me, the space my feet were actively occupying. In the following moments, I realized I had a decision to make as to the severity of the conflict I would instigate. I had immediately decided that conflict would be unavoidable, with the brashness of my rude neighbor's most recent offense. There was a scale of following actions that I could have taken. I could have nudged his leg and treated the scenario like an honest mistake, which it was not. I could have gone straight to yelling, which would have been most uncomfortable in the early stages of a red-eye flight. I opted for a multi-step approach. First, I, quote, accidentally stepped on his toes with my heel. He responded to this by pulling his leg up, clearly looking to readjust and place it back near where it was. I caught his knee as he pulled his leg up and firmly guided it back to the space he was allotted. No eye contact was made, but he grunted in displeasure of my actions. In anticipation of a retort, I remained ready to defend what little territory this American Airlines flight had loaned me for the evening. As in most scenarios regarding any scale of conflict, my heart beat quickly and my adrenaline surged for triple, maybe even quadruple, the amount of time the situation actually took place. After the incident, he appeared to abandon his invasion and spent the remainder of the flight impersonating a hibernating grizzly bear with sleep apnea. Between the adrenaline that remained in my system and his unnaturally loud, throaty snores, very little sleep was had. Fuck that guy. I was an exchange student in China around 2000, and with a fellow buddy I was exploring Xi'an. Our hotel was on a very big 6-lanes brightly lit street with half the people foreigners. At about 10 p.m. me and my mate decided to go out and find something to eat. At an intersection we found a smallish shop, bought a snack and asked around with super limited Chinese and English, and found someone who spoke English, the quote niece of the shop owner. She was super young, but spoke good English and said that she could direct us to a very good and cheap restaurant. So we agreed, and she leads us just down the street and into the non-tourist part of the city. It was interesting how the surroundings changed. After a few minutes, we were the only foreigners on the street, and a lot of people were staring at us. The buildings became more run down, and the place wasn't very brightly lit, but it was still charming. She kept talking to us, asking us questions, where we stayed, how long we stayed, what our plans were, etc. She also mentions a few times that she was studying and 21 years of age. This raised a few alarms with me, but me and my mate didn't want to be rude, and we were really hungry. After about 15 minutes, we arrived at a very small and somewhat charming restaurant. I don't know the proper name for this kind of shop, but in China, at least the cities that I visited, there were a lot of shops in prefabricated houses. Each house had 2 smallish shops on the street level, and you could see all sorts of businesses in these, some of the bigger ones renting 2 adjoining ones to form a bigger shop, etc. The restaurant was in one such half-size store. There was just 4 tables, 1 counter to the kitchen, and in the back there was 1 video game machine. With the help of our translator, we ordered and then she excused herself. The food was really good and cheap. We both got a super large bowl of ramen, a heaping dish of different baozi dumplings, and several beverages for no more than 25 to 30 bucks. So far so good, but what really made the situation strange was several other factors. For one, the other guests in the restaurants looked like straight out of a crime flick, and they were talking about us, pointing and laughing. One had a bad knife scar on his cheek, the other one a broken nose, and a third one, I kid you not, an eye patch. While we ate, we saw a lot of people gawking at us, but especially noticed something like gangsters. There were 4 youngsters with matching leather jackets and short cropped hair who patrolled the street at least 4 times while we stayed there and always looked straight at us while they passed the shop. After we ate and paid, all of a sudden our 21-year-old translator turned up again, inquired if the food was good, and offered to take us to some very good place with a lot of fun. We declined and thanked her, but said that we would just return as we were tired. She fast-talked us and told us about a party, beautiful women, young girls, etc., but when we saw the younger gangsters again, we waited 1 minute and then just bailed out of there. She followed us and seemed very frustrated and even panicky that we left so suddenly. She tried her best to convince us to follow her offer, but we got out of there ASAP. In high-speed mode, we made it back to that big 6-laned main road and said goodbye to her. That whole situation was actually super scary. In hindsight, they were probably all just very nice, hard-working people who had just never seen foreigners in this part of the city. But those youngster gangers, those cliché pirates at the other table, and the shady way how that girl tried to goad us into God knows where, multiple times stating that she was 21 years of age, all of this together just led me to the conclusion that we got out of there just in time. I hadn't had any major incidents while traveling, but it finally caught up with me this April. My husband and I were in Cape Town and went to Our Bay to do a snorkeling with seals thing. It wrapped up by midday, so we decided to go check out a farmer's market that was only a 10-minute walk away. It was a pretty touristy area, broad daylight around noon, and a short walk. It seemed like no big deal. We started walking towards the market and approached the start of an S-curve in the road. We see people walking past us in the opposite direction and cars driving by. We get to the middle of the S-curve, so the area we came from is now hidden from us, as is the area we are heading to. It was a blind spot, so to speak. All of a sudden, we just noticed these 2 guys walk past us, again. They had passed us just a couple minutes earlier, going the other way. We remembered them since one of the guys had a bright orange shirt on. Next thing I know, this orange shirt guy is walking towards me with a wooden pole raised threateningly. He doesn't say a word and starts hitting me. There's literally no one else around at this point, nor any cars driving by. The next few minutes are a blur. I just remember yelling no and screaming for help and somehow ending up on the ground trying to kick this guy away. After what feels like forever, a community patrol drives around the corner. He's basically a local neighborhood watch guy. He sees what's happening and pulls up and gets out of the car, which causes the 2 guys to bolt. We end up being taken to a fire department by our savior, who then patch us up a little bit before getting taken to the police by an ambulance to file a report. My husband had to get some stitches on his elbow from blocking some blows, and we both had a ton of bruises, but luckily no broken bones or anything else major. It still feels so surreal now. It's a I can't believe that actually happened to me kind of moment. We thought we're always aware of our surroundings, but we let our guards down that day and got really unlucky that no one else was walking when we were. It just taught us that these things can happen to anyone at any time, not just when it's dark out. Always be aware of your surroundings, especially in a place that has a reputation for violent crime. After a recent trek through Nepal, I decided to fly to Dhaka, Bangladesh. Bangladesh Airlines was offering a sweet deal, and I had to leave Nepal anyway due to my expiring visa. So, on a whim, I bought the tickets and went there solo. Of course, the night before, my travel buddies and I decided to have one final night out. And of course, after a few too many beers, we ended up in some shady places with shady food and drink. Waking up the next morning, the day of my flight, I immediately knew something was off. I could feel it deep in my stomach. It wasn't the kind of food poisoning you throw up right after eating. I sat in the hostel, waiting for my taxi and waiting to vomit. I knew it was coming, the nausea almost completely overwhelming. I managed to keep it together until finally arriving at the airport. I started throwing up in the unair-conditioned waiting room next to a dude having the same problem but with the other end. I threw up 3 times before even boarding the plane. So I finally get on the plane and manage to hold it down until after takeoff, when the seatbelt sign finally switches off. Once it did, I threw off my seatbelt and half ran, half waddled to the back of the plane. Naturally, both were occupied. Being the incredible problem solver that I am, I snatched a vomit bag from one of the nearby seats and began the music of fucking misery. I'm halfway filling up this poor piece of paper when the entire bottom falls out. Like the entire bottom half of this bag became so disgusted with its content, it had to reject them completely. I now have vomit drenching my clothes. A plain white t-shirt was a poor choice. The flight attendants finally see the catastrophe taking place and start banging on the bathroom doors, where some poor soul emerges confused. After my business was finally done, and with my clothes now ruined, I shamefully slunk back to my seat. When I finally arrive in Dhaka, I walk up to the counter to get my visa on arrival. Even though I consider myself a pretty savvy traveler in terms of research, nothing I had read up to that point mentioned an exit flight requirement for a visa. So the officer asked for my exit flight information, and I'm doing my best to keep my shit together. Internally, I have no fucking clue what to do. Thankfully, the airport's free Wi-Fi was available, so I hopped online to book a random flight to get me through this gate. In my anxiety of this flight, the fact that I was sick was completely lost on me. I just forgot. So I'm sitting there at the counter, and I feel a deep rumble in my stomach. I'm thinking, yeah, this'll be a great fart, and let the baby blow. It wasn't a fart. I just shat my pants at a visa desk in fucking Bangladesh, with a customs officer looking me in the face. I can feel the slow, warm trickle moving down my legs. It was literal shame in physical form. Either understanding I was unwell, or perhaps smelling the situation, the visa officer mercifully provided me a visa. I spent the next week in Dhaka, Bangladesh, shitting and vomiting my brains out, and burnt that pair of underwear forever. I lost 10 pounds that week, eating Pringles and drinking water while watching the Airbender movie rerun over and over again. It's a fucking terrible movie, but it was on the only English channel available. Solo female traveler here who's done my fair share of world travel. I was in Athens a couple years ago and went to go read in a park. I'd been traveling for about 3 months at the time and had just gotten off a massive trek in a different country and came to Greece to relax and enjoy. I had been a few times before, so no need to go to all the historical sites in a rush. A day in the park in the sun sounded perfect. Anyway, I was getting settled into a bench and got my book out to read. About a half hour later, I get that feeling that someone is watching me. I look up and see an older guy, maybe about 55 to 65, standing about 20 yards away just staring at me. He was like half in the foliage, too. There was also a little hill, so I couldn't see his full figure, just his face and upper chest through all the trees. He looked pretty harmless, but I did think it was weird, so I got up and cut through the park to head back to my hostel. He ended up following me. I assumed he didn't mean to follow me, per se, that this was just an awkward but innocent thing, kinda like when you say goodbye to someone too soon and then you still walk in the same direction with them a few feet more. I rationalized and assumed that he too had to leave the park at the exact same time as myself in the same direction. I was wrong. I take a turn to lose him that I now note was a bad idea. This took me to a more secluded part of the park. He ends up following me again. Now I notice he's really staring at me. I pick up my pace, but I don't start running because generally I've learned showing fear just makes things so much worse. I also break off a stick from a tree just in case he gets closer so I can have a very lame weapon. At this point he's still about 10 yards away and always kind of hidden behind a bush. And then that's when I notice that the guy's got his hand down his pants. This guy followed me around the park for probably 10 minutes, jacking off before I finally found a crowded area and sat down next to a bunch of women and later joined a tour group. It's not super terrifying, but just the weird image of him staring at me and perving on me kinda gives me the creeps to this day. At the airport when I landed, a cab came up and offered me a reasonable fare. I was loading my stuff in the car when an airport worker came over to me and warned me not to get in that cab because he will not take me to my hotel. I was like, what? She helped me get my stuff and told him she was watching him and he isn't getting another one. I asked her to explain. She was like, he kidnaps tourists, and that was it. She smiled and told me to call Lyft. A few days later, I ran into another dude at a farmer's market. This dude would not leave me alone. He followed me from booth to booth. He followed me to the beach, back to my hotel. He kept trying to talk to me and flirt. I was like, I'm fine, I just want to get some stuff, see you around. I was talking to a hotel worker because I made friends, and she asked me if I frequently traveled alone. I told her yeah, mostly because of the last-minute deals. At the time, I was a student, so I had a lot more time plus discount programs. He was hovering, listening to this. I went back to the farmer's market while she went back to work because another guest had come up. I was trying to stay in a very public area, starting to get nervous. This taffy vendor saw me and saw what was happening and called me over. He told me about all of the flavors he had. Creepy stalker dude came over and asked me if I wanted to go for a walk. He says, "It's nice. My hotel has a very nice view and you should come check it out. I have some friends who would like to meet you." I said no, please leave me alone. And Taffy Man, my hero, was like, "You're ruining my sale, go away." The guy eventually backed off, but was still lingering out of earshot. Taffy Guy had called me over solely to get that guy to go away and didn't expect me to buy any taffy. He said he wanted to make sure that I was safe, and if I wanted to try some I could, but he would let me know when the coast was clear. So I hung with the Taffy Guy for like an hour, and he told me it was safe. I bought like 8 bags and thanked him. When going to drop off the taffy at my room, lo and behold, my stalker had found me. I ran for it, locked the door, and waited for another hour or maybe 2 hours before I left my room and went to a restaurant and stayed there. I called my hotel for help, and they had someone escort me around. Going home, I again called Lyft. While I'm waiting outside my hotel for my Lyft, guess who is there? Stalker Man with the creepy cab guy. I run inside, find a hotel worker, tell her what's what. She calls my Lyft and tells them to a different spot so I can get out of there without being killed. Luckily I lived. I'm here to tell this story now. Shout out to her and the very, very cute Taffy Guy. I went to a big city in Colombia, and the hostel had a rooftop hangout spot. I'm a man from the USA. People left one by one until it was just me and a girl from Europe. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I last remember checking. She was quite friendly, and the conversation was very surface-level casual, asking about the best restaurants in town or something like that. Now, I was not drunk or doing drugs. I only had 2 light beers, they were less than 3%, in about 2.5 hours. But the next thing I remember from the night was waking up in the early morning hours in a hotel hallway bathroom shower with a jacket on now. The lights were completely out, and I struggled to gather my senses as I crawled around utterly confused in pitch blackness until I felt a toilet and realized I was in a bathroom. It was my jacket, by the way, but it was previously in a suitcase in my room. I then went back to my room, shared with 3 other people by creaky wood bunk beds, to sleep more after that. The next day, when I asked, nobody noticed anything strange about my night. They all slept soundly the whole night, which is also strange given I apparently came in inebriated to some degree. Got a jacket out of a suitcase on the top bunk, left, then came back. I honestly didn't bring it up to the girl ever, because I truly don't believe she was the cause of anything. We both saw each other plenty after that around the hostel for another week. She was genuinely a kind person. I didn't feel physically hurt whatsoever, and nothing of mine was stolen. I had a smartphone and about $150 cash in my pocket. I've never gotten an explanation for the night though, and I've never been aware of any sleepwalking habit. I was 18, and it was my first time traveling alone. I went to Argentina for 3 months, my first weekend, and I'm wandering around Buenos Aires. At the time I knew enough Spanish to get by, and a man approaches me and asks me for directions in Spanish. I tell him that I'm not from here. He then asks if I'm a tourist. I say yes, and he seems delighted, quickly telling me that he is too. He offers up the idea to explore the city together. I, alone in the big city, agree. We start walking together, and he seems like a really nice guy. After about an hour, he says, "Tengo hambre," which means I'm hungry. I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and it's about 1, so we go out to a nice restaurant. He tells me I have to try the steaks and red wine. I'm not much of a wine fan, but he convinces me. We're there for about an hour, and the bill comes. It's 140 pesos. He pulls out 100 pesos. I try to pay for my half, but he only lets me pay 40 pesos. He tells me I can get the beers later. We continue on our little adventure and eventually come to a bar with outdoor seating. The waitress brings out a liter of beer, and we relax. Soon enough, another liter of beer comes out. We finish the second liter and leave the bar. And all of a sudden I wake up 8 hours later, missing my debit card, iPod, cell phone, and travel guide. I was driving from Georgia to California to visit a friend. I didn't want to fly because I wanted to sightsee on the way. The hotel I booked on Expedia screamed run from the get-go, but I was exhausted and wanted to rest. I got my room key and checked in. I locked the door, and because I'm always on guard, I locked the bar on the door for extra safety. About 4 a.m., I was sleeping and heard someone trying to come into my room. They had opened the door but couldn't get past the little bar that was locked. I quickly got up, threw my clothes on, and went to the door to see what was going on. 2 guys outside the door with their hand on the slit of the door yelling at me. They kept saying, "Come here, pretty girl. Oh, a pretty face," or something like that. I called the front desk to see what was going on, and they said, "Oh, I didn't know that you were still here." I was beyond furious and went to the front desk with all of my stuff. The lady at the desk said I didn't have a reservation even though I had my papers saying I was checked in. I had my car decal stickers for parking there and the room key. She said that she rented the room out that I was in for the next month. Flabbergasted, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She looked up my information and said, "Oh, I see, you didn't book with us, but through Expedia. We don't partner with them." Still confused as to why in the world I was given a room, paid for it, and had issues being in it. She refused to call her manager at 5 a.m. by that point, so I waited until they got in at 9 a.m., demanded a refund, got it, and checked out. No matter how terrifying the ordeal seemed, I think it would have ended differently had I not locked the bar on the door.